Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the final webinar in our series we've been running over the summer months, looking at the future of residential development. My name's Neil Kelly. I'm one of the partners in the residential development team here at Bidwells. This afternoon, we're going to be hearing from my colleagues Mike Derbyshire, the head of planning, and Danny Personally, head of landscape design. We've got a slight change to the title of this session this afternoon. So from the outset, and we're always planning on ending with the value of good design, and this came out of our thoughts for the government's direction of travel, looking at increasing standards and quality, and sort of touching on some of the reports that have come out over recent years, particularly sort of the living with beauty. Now, clearly, events have been somewhat overtaken by the publication of the white paper last week, Planning for the Future, where this comes to the fore even more than it did previously, where the government setting out its thoughts for a reform system that places a high regard on quality, design and local vernacular, and the impact of that on residential development and the ability to fast track schemes of beauty. So I think we've got a lot that we talk about this afternoon. I think it's very timely. Encourage everyone to submit questions as we're going along. Format will be the same as we've done in the previous webinars, where we'll have presentations from Danny and Mike, and then we'll open it up to the floor for a Q&A session. And we've got a little bit more time this afternoon because no doubt there might be quite a bit that we need to chat through. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to you, Danny.
Thanks, Neil, and thanks everyone for joining us. So to preface the discussion, which Mike will lead later on the planning white paper, we're just going to quickly run through first the National Design Guide and the value of good design. So the planning white papers will sit beside the National Design Guide that was prepared last year by MHCLG, and the suite of documents which are proposing reform to the planning system in England currently. So what's the current value of good design? We all know good design can be absolutely crucial in obtaining planning approvals. However, the way that this is applied and the standards involved do tend to vary quite a lot from authority to authority. So we're really welcoming this national standardisation. The housing design audit for England, which was undertaken last year by the Place Alliance, revealed that new housing was overwhelmingly poor, while a fifth of the developments surveyed were contrary to the NPPF. Unfortunately, generally worse standards were found in less affluent areas, which tended to lock in disadvantage, and really speaks to the opportunities for developments to address social and well-being considerations within the fabric of development. So the renewed focus that the planning white paper brings in Pillar 2 on a holistic approach to design, including some of those more social and environmental factors, is really to be welcomed, especially if it's to be used as a targeted approach to help to address social inequality. So what does this mean? Oh, sorry, Matt, could you just go back? Thank you. So what does this mean for housing values? So the housing design audit found that there was a marked uplift in higher quality schemes in terms of value, but that most of those schemes tended to be located in places that could really support that uplift. And we well know that the basic fundamentals of good design need not be expensive where they're applied right throughout a scheme. And so the fact that the planning white paper is looking to roll this out nationally, I think is a massive opportunity. So moving on to the National Design Guidance, it's part of this new or soon to be revised suite of documents that will revitalise the planning system at a national level. So the National Design Guide is to act as an exemplar to guide the development of places which can be beautiful, enduring and successful in practice. And so these are set out under three key themes that you can see in the diagram next to on the screen in front of you, sorry, which is our climate, character and community. So these 10 characteristics, which include lifespan and context, we've all touched upon throughout our 4-part series and will increasingly be a focus in developing proposals for landowners, for house builders, for developers and for project teams alike. So the NDG addresses the question of how we recognise well-designed places by outlining and illustrating government priority for well-designed places in the form of the 10 characteristics. So any well-designed place is about making sure that we're making the right choices at all levels within a development and the way it's put together. And these 10 characteristics need to be embedded to various degrees within the layout, within the form and scale of buildings, within their appearance, the way that the landscape interacts with them, their materials, detailing, and also the technical and social infrastructure related to any development that takes place. Crucially, the National Design Guide also provides an overview of the National Model Design Code, which is currently being drafted and will set out the baseline standard of quality and practice for local authorities in developing their local character guidance. So the 10 characteristics in local design codes, Matt, if you could switch to the next slide, that would be great. So it will really show the way forward in how these character elements are applied locally. So in a well-designed place, the 10 characteristics which you saw previously will be brought together in a mutually supportive way to interact to create a character of the site. And so to provide clarity and to act as the basis for fast-tracking application decisions on design, these broad principles will be developed into more specific standards by local authorities which are locally relevant and are subject to local consultation. And so the most relevant characteristics that local authorities will be asked to consider will be determined by a number of attributes, including locally identified priorities, the strategic priorities of the local authority, the priorities of a particular user group, the scale of a proposal, the site and its location, and the point in the design process which any given development is at. So as we well know, well-designed places tend to have a really clear story guiding the design concept, and this concept really embeds itself within the development in terms of layout, in terms of form and appearance, and informs the detailing of the development as well. And crucially, it may be that it approaches creates new approaches within a locality, whether it contrasts with or it complements with its existing context. So what implications will this have for design value? So our residential colleagues, Matt, if you could just flick to the next slide, that'd be great. Thank you. Have kindly provided us with a real life example. So over the last 15 years, Cambridge City has seen a 95% to 100% growth in general value. However, at Accordia, which was the first residential development to be awarded the Sterling Prize in 2008, growth values have been more like 120 to 130%. So that's sort of 25% plus over the Cambridge values. So while it might not solely be an attribute of good design, it's certainly a major influence. And it demonstrates the way that good design has potential benefits, especially where key pieces of a scheme are retained by landowners or developers over the longer term. So, do we think that the value of good design will increase? I think fundamentally, yes, but there are some pretty fundamental questions which still remain. So those, I think, are simply what are locals going to want within design codes, and how will competing views be satisfied? Will local design codes provide support for innovative design which moves the architectural vernacular forward? And related to that, will modern methods of construction be deliverable where a traditional vernacular is preferred? Will the allocation of growth areas influence the development of differing housing typologies within the pattern books or standard house types of volume house builders? So the housing design audit found that the best schemes tended to average at around 56 dwellings per hectare, because it supported a mix of public transport, mixed use and local facilities, and it will be harder for lower density schemes to achieve those same aims. And we also know that good design will become more important to a smooth planning process, with greater definition of the expectations in regards to design at the outset. So fundamentally, we believe that the value of good design has definitely increased. with greater priority within the potential changes to the planning system and a greater recognition of the role that good design can play in addressing wider society and environmental concerns. So I'll now hand over to Mike, who'll take you through some of the more detailed elements of the planning white paper.
Thank you, Danny. Good afternoon, everyone. It's like the apocalypse out there in Cambridge at the moment, so I hope it's a little bit sunnier, although we need the rain. I've just been reminded, if you've got any questions, please start to feed them through now. It would be really helpful. We'll start feeding them to the panelists. Danny, I'm going to drop on a chord here because it's probably an appropriate place to start. Sterling Prize winner in 2008 lauded, but I can tell you at the time, the amount of objection to that was huge. English Heritage, whose offices were behind, were objected vehemently to the scheme. I know about that because I presented a scheme in 2008. So what we know as good design today might not be the good design of tomorrow, but I'm going to come on to that because I think we have a real challenge on our hands here. I'm not going to be a cynic because I think it's a fantastic opportunity to do things, but the devil is in the detail, and I'm not sure whether these changes are significant or whether they're radical enough. And if you move on, Matt, to the next slide, some of you may be aware that we've been involved in something called the Radical REGEN manifesto that we launched in Parliament Square last September. It was a view of a few of us in the industry, ourselves, Perkins and Wills and Blackstock, that nothing was happening. We were hearing about reform, but with Brexit and other things, nothing was happening. So we took it upon ourselves, looking at the ARC in particular, but not exclusively so, to look at what radical in our terms really meant. Please feel free, we'll happily share that with you. But if you go on to the next slide, Matt, we had a number of recommendations, our recommendations, which have been picked up. And if you start to look at the overarching aspirations of the white paper, if you look at number 14, digital planning and digital engagement, number 15, if you look at updating, if you look at the way that we've changed the use classes order, which we said was something that needed to happen, a number of the changes we promoted have been put through. And in terms of good design, I'd like to focus on number 16 as well through my presentation, well-being. And I think good design is all about well-being. COVID has taught us one thing, that living in our houses is key, and design must be based around people. If you move on to the next slide, please, Matt. So when I started read through the white paper, I kind of like had to remind myself what the NPPF currently says about design. And it's not exactly lacking on some of the things that we're talking about at the moment. And I'm not going to go through the words, the 3 paragraphs in front of you, but we're using words like fundamental. Good design is a key aspect of sustainable development. We talk about planning, the plan making process, and the role design has in terms of plan making. We talk about the expectations at an early stage of the process. We talk about engagement. So we have embedded within the current NPPF quite a strong framework for good design. And I think most people understand that good design is embedded at the heart of sustainable development. But why isn't it coming through? Why isn't all of this aspiration coming through in terms of the design that we're seeing on the ground? And is the white paper radically changing the agenda to such a degree that we're going to get these changes through? So Matt, if you can move on to the next slide. I thought I'd try and be clever. I'm the planner, I know that's difficult. But the quote on the right-hand side is a bit of a quote and some words from Mark Twain. We turn old ideas into new curious combinations, but who reckon they are, and this is the quote, the same old pieces of coloured glass that have been in use throughout the ages. And I'm afraid, after 32 years as a planner, starting off in 1988 under the old PPS one where you didn't touch design, I'm not actually sure that this radical approach, this planning for beautiful places, is that radical. So we're looking at national model design codes, and I think I read somewhere that Urban had now been appointed, which is a great appointment. We're looking at worked examples. I think number 3 is key, and if they deliver on that, that will make a difference. They're talking about updating manual for streets, creation of a body to support locally popular design codes. Well, I thought we've had that for the last 20 years, but perhaps I'm missing something. And fast tracking, or development that's sustainable, should be granting plan permission without delay at the moment. So be interested to see how that fast tracking works on the ground. But I did say to Neil, I'm not going to be a pessimist, because I think the government is trying to do things. Whether or not they understand what the real problems are in the process, I'm going to go into. Could you go on to the next slide, Matt? I said nothing's new, but I don't know if anyone's seen this. Stephen Proctor gave me this copy. It's distinctively local. It's a paper that was produced last year by 4 architects: Paula Thomas Edwards, Proctor Matthews, HTA, PRP. We're working with all of them, which is great. And I'm grateful for a hard copy. But if you get the chance to read this, do, because it's looking at local examples, what interesting design is. But what I wanted to come on is the next page, which is, that was a cute, thanks Matt, which was for the elements that the architects have looked at, and designing for people I mentioned earlier. But for good design to happen, you need to look at it from the very beginning in terms of the client's land ownership management. What value is the client putting on? How much value is there to that landowner, that developer for that process? What is the stewardship arrangement for the land? What is the quality of land, the green belt? So land ownership and management from the very earliest stages is key to the outcome of design. I'll talk about planning in a second, but nowhere in this process does the paper that I see deal meaningfully with construction. We've all been there with the QSs and the challenges we have with changes in procurement. When we get into the construction phases, it's a huge challenge to bring things on budget. And I don't think the process is there at the moment for local authorities to be able to control that phase. And I'm not sure the white paper, and perhaps the audience can pick up on me, but once you get past that stage, I remember I did a public inquiry with Frank Filsco of Make in the in about 2002. Tom Hill was the QC. It was an appeal. And we had an architect as an inspector who was great because he totally understood the arguments. And we made great play on the quality of the architecture. Remember, at the end of the inquiry, we presented a contract to the inspector, who was an architect, and he said to me, Mike, it's a design and build contract. You've just been talking about design, and I have a design and build contract. So we had to novate the architect there and then as part of the process to ensure that consistency. But there is that tension in the planning process, because it's not just about the planning process, it's about how you make sure that quality flows through into the construction phase as well. And I'm not sure the white paper deals with that. Next slide, Matt. I think this is key. If we can genuinely bring some skilled designers into the landscape architects, urban designers, people with real design skills and with the attitude for doing things, that'll make a huge difference to how we deal with design. And we're very lucky in Cambridge and a number of the authorities around. There are some very talented, very proactive urban designers that have undoubtedly made the schemes I've worked in better. But that isn't the case for a large number of authorities. Many have none at all. But they do say they're going to address that issue, and I'll be interested to see what the outcomes say. Welcome that. Next slide, Matt. So the approach is welcome. I quote Mark Twain, I'm not sure that anything is radically new, and I'll be grateful for feedback on that. For me, though, the final decision is left to the planning committee. And after 32 years, my experience is mixed. I'll go to the last bullet point. They are not fettered on design. And if it's a politically unpopular scheme, there are a number of soft issues they rely on in refusals. We all know this. Landscape impact is one. Design is another. We've all been where they've gone against the design of conservation panels. I talked about quality in the construction phase, and we talk about the manual for streets, but I've had cases where the council have just commissioned through their refuse collection the world's largest refuse truck for efficiencies. So how on earth are we going to plan for manual for street type roads when the refuse vehicles and everything else have just grown in size for efficiency and cost saving? There genuinely needs to be some guru within council that has the authority to take a remit that says placemaking comes first, and that sometimes is at the expense of the practical servicing of sites like this. So we need a completely joined up approach. And when you're talking to planning committee members, and when we're talking about devolving design to local people, I've got one more slide. And this is one of the first slides I had as a student many years ago. You know, the architect, the sophisticated audience is talking about the duck, but they're seeing a rabbit, and it's Wittgenstein's duck or rabbit. You're talking completely different languages. How do we make sure we bridge the language and that what we're talking about is understood? There's a fundamental language barrier here. This is a very sophisticated subject matter, and it's wrong to assume that the audience that we have fully understands it. But I think it's great that they've started to grapple with some of the issues, but I'm not sure it's radical enough. Thanks, Neil.
Danny, thanks very much for that. To everyone out there, any questions, get them in on the bar at the bottom. We've also got available the other Bidwell's partners who've been involved in the series so far. So we've got David Bentley, Head of Residential, Nick Pettit, Head of Project Management, and Giles Dobson, Head of Rural, who we can bring in just to pick up on some of the points that are going to be raised. I think the one to start with, though, we've talked about good design a number of times during the presentations. I'll put back across to both Mike, Danny, and I'll probably bring in David Bentley as well. What does good design actually mean to all of you in your relevant discipline? Mike, start with you first.
Do you want to repeat that, Neil? Sorry. I blinked out for a second. You're on mute, Neil.
Yeah, what does good design mean to you, Mike? And we're going to bring in Danny and David Bentley to give their thoughts. Because we talk about good design a lot, but actually, what do we mean by good design? And it goes back to the Doug Rath. Good design means different things to different people.
Good design to me is I'm a professional. I head up a planning team at Bidwell's. I want to work on schemes that transform areas. We start our profession to do things that make a difference, Neil. We want to work with schemes that are award-winning, but we want to work with schemes that when we look back 20 years' time, when we walk around them and we've been involved with them, we want schemes that we can be proud of. We want schemes that last. We want schemes that provide a legacy for the future, in the same way that schemes designed in the 19th and 20s and 30s. I started my career in Welwyn Hatfield, in Welwyn Garden City. It was an absolute pleasure to walk around that city. I'd like to think that we are involved now with schemes that generate that same sense of pleasure. Neil.
Thanks. Danny, bring you in.
So I very much echo what Mike said, but for me, I think it's very much about those Vitruvian principles. So making sure that something functions well and is beautiful is kind of at the heart of what we do. I think function is something that's often overlooked. And making sure that you're getting that right is probably at the heart for me of good design. And then we're starting to layer up some of those aesthetic considerations. And as Mike said, the way that then ages and develops over time is key. So making sure that you're getting the detailing right, especially when it comes to things like street trees, to make sure that they are going to be there for the next 50, 100, 200 years, and that you're designing in a degree of flexibility to allow that aging to happen gracefully and beautifully, I think is for me what success looks like.
Neil, but Danny, what we find is the utility companies, we find the county council, we find they want these clear verges. They want easy access. They want minimum maintenance, don't they? So there's have to be a sea change in the attitude of some of the utilities companies for that.
Oh, completely. And it's going to be key to combating climate change as well too. So the quicker it can be grappled with, I think the better for everybody.
But we'll come back to that tension point in a minute, actually, because I think it's an important one. But we'll just bring in David Bentley just to give his thoughts on the sales side. What does good design mean to you, David?
Cordia is a good example, isn't it? For me, good design starts when someone turns the corner and steps out their car to look at a scheme. We can fail at the first hurdle for a lot of people. So I think what you mentioned, Mike, placemaking is completely important. I think quality design is good. Innovative design is welcome, but it needs to be practical and user-friendly. Too often I stand in houses thinking, why have we done this? This isn't practical. This doesn't work. So I understand it. Accordia actually is a good example, not wishing to sort of go on about Accordia, but we spent a long time on Accordia, afternoons in architects' offices, dissembling little miniature houses to see in the practicalities of how they work, because that was quite groundbreaking for the city. And it wasn't an easy sell. So did it pay? I don't know. But the sales rates wasn't very strong initially until we started to get going. Now it's there. It's an established, recognised scheme with a REBA flag attached to it. But initially it was quite difficult to work that. And I think too many times we probably try to be too clever on our design, is my opinion. but I welcome it, absolutely. But the value add, I do agree with. I do think it adds to the value moving forward, but it's not just the design element. It's literally, as I say, as soon as you turn the corner, that sense of arrival, personally speaking.
Excellent. Thanks, David. I just want to go back to that point that Mike and Danny, you've already picked up on in terms of the tension that already exists in the planning process between the sort of the landscape-led approach and placemaking approach versus the various technical constraints that you need to adhere to. Obviously, we've seen enough examples where highways takes predominance, and you're designing a scheme just to fit to the road layouts, and sort of Mike's example of the refuse truck. How do we change that moving forward? Who is going to be the person that takes the lead to say, no, this is what good design is moving forward, and we're not going to be led by the road design?
I think there's definitely a role there for questioning the risk that's taken on by utilities companies, because they're taking that position for a reason. But I think that risk needs to be balanced against the very real and tangible benefits that having a well-designed landscape-led development can bring, and what that can do, for house prices and values, but also for making sure that you've got a streetscape that's multifunctional, that people actually want to use, and that starts to help us address things like the urban heat island effect. It's very complex and interwoven, and so to just quickly ask the Highways Authority to change their tune, I think becomes quite a complicated ask. Mike, I don't know if you feel differently.
Well, I'll give an example, a recent one. We've been working with Urban Splash and Procter & Matthews on the modular scheme at Northstowe, and we had a number of challenges in terms of there was a very strong policy framework about quality and exemplar scheme, but what we had was an individual that sat across all of the disciplines that was there to arbitrate effectively. So they recognised already that there were these tensions within the system, but they had a process to mitigate that. But the overriding aspect was that it was the placemaking that took priority. The individual that was involved in that mitigation had the authority to make those decisions. So there are certain things you can't overcome in terms of safety. Danny's quite right. There are certain non-negotiables. But there was a rational discussion based around placemaking where compromises were made to the betterment of the scheme. So it was recognised, dealt with a very strong policy framework. I'll be interested from the audience is whether that experience is repeated elsewhere.
So that's quite interesting, Mike. Was that individual part of the project team, or was it more of a local authority position? Yeah.
Very senior individual within the councils.
Oh, fantastic.
Well, I'll bring Nick Pettit into this in a minute as well, in terms of his experience on the infrastructure delivery. But I think just before we do, sort of Mike, just staying with you on the tension that sometimes exists between a district level and a county council level in terms of trying to progress plan applications. Does that need to be streamlined moving forward if you think we're going to really get sort of a betterment on good quality design?
You're seeing a massive reorganisation of local government at the moment, Neil. If you look at the ministry, it actually has a decentralisation department at the heart of it. And if you look at Hertfordshire, they're looking to create a unitary authority in Hertfordshire. There'll be discussions around the Norfolk and Suffolk and Essex authorities pretty shortly about bringing these authorities together. And we're going to see many more larger unitary authorities pretty soon, I think, over the next 5 to 10 years that go to the heart of that and deal with that, Neil.
Right, okay. Nick, if I can bring you in, because obviously we've heard about some of the tensions that exist just in terms of the sort of highways and technical constraints taking priority. What's your experience in terms of, sort of feeding into the design team to actually embed good placemaking from an early stage? What role do you think that you have in sort of the development management side?
It's interesting listening to the conversations there, because I think when we started this exercise off, what we were talking about is the alternative development route that we were trying to portray to everybody, which is about the long-term strategic land developer staying in on the project. And what we can see from the 2 or 3 models that we're running at the moment as the strategic land developer, that we are in control of some of the issues that Mike was talking about there. So we're defining street scenes, street settings, because we're controlling them from our own point of view with a view to long-term putting those into a trust that operates the villages that we're building. I think it'd probably be harder in an urban setting, But certainly from that type of model, where you're looking at the long-term embedded role, that quality of design can be held within the project team, and ultimately will deliver those additional profits that Dave mentioned, that we all mentioned on our previous calls. So for me, good design shouldn't be a problem when you're staying with this model. I think that the other development models that we have are more of a challenge to maintain that quality of development, and therefore, are they right? Are they wrong? I don't know either is right or wrong. It's just a different scenario that you end up with.
Okay. Thanks, Neil. We've got a question here from Russell Dennis that I'll put to Danny and Mike. Have you got any examples of where bureaucratic process has either engendered or encouraged good design? Like you were mentioning one that you've been actively involved in, but is there sort of anything else that you've got recently that's a good example?
I think it's a loaded question. The answer is no. Bureaucracy does not help. Positive decision making is not bureaucracy. Where you have detailed, and I think one of the weaknesses of the white paper is it's talking about master planning, it's talking about detailed SPDs, and then it's talking about fast tracking beauty. Well, the master plans that I've been involved in nationally, across the whole of the arc, have added at least 5 years to the process. Far too prescriptive, not allowing for innovations, changing in markets. Much of the scheme I'm dealing with in Northstowe at the moment with Procter & Matthews and Urban Splash. Yeah, how are we going to deal with modular construction moving forward and what that brings? And good design shouldn't be expensive. Creative architects will come up with good designs that might be cheaper with unusual materials. Well, you can imagine what the local design codes might throw up. You know, in some of the parts of the world we work in, I can imagine there's a lot of thatch and daub and wattle that's preferred. Yeah, there's going to be some innate tensions there. But proactive officers that are properly educated in terms of design add to the process, in my experience. They add to the process. The planning committee process invariably doesn't. Where you have a group of committee members at the end, and we've all been there, where we've had 3 or 4 design committee reviews, quality panels with thumbs up, and then I once had an application refused on overlooking. It was from a basement. And despite the best endeavours of the planning officer to tell the committee that it wasn't possible to have overlooking from a basement, that's what went on the refusal notice. So, proactive, bureaucracy is a loaded word. A well-resourced local authority that's proactive absolutely assists the process. Ill-informed members of the process don't.
Mike, do you think that the design conservation panels and design quality review panels help this situation? Because I quite often find that you get conflicting information back from them, as opposed to what you're discussing with the planning officers.
I'm on either side of the fence. I think the process is potentially a good one. But what happens, Nick, is that you do a presentation, you deal with the issues, you come back 2 months later, and you've got 3 members on the panel. And you start the ball rolling again. The process needs to be much more tightly managed. I think the process inherently is a good process, and it adds to it, providing the panel members are the right members. But there needs to be a degree of consistency and uniformity across that for it to work. You can't revisit issues on meeting number 2 and 3. Once they're locked down, they should be locked down. They shouldn't be revisited.
That's right. Danny, if I could come to you, it's a question from Howard Felsted. In your pie chart of good design, he asked, should the slice relating to attractive buildings be much bigger in the future following the emphasis on beautiful development? And if so, will it be at the cost of the other important elements of good design?
Well, I think not, because although we are asking for beauty, I don't think that is necessarily limited to the buildings. It needs to be scoped much wider, so it needs to take into account the street scenes that we were just discussing and the way that they come together and the way that can help to serve well-being and the longevity of a project. So I think all of those slide pieces or pie pieces, sorry, almost being equally weighted is probably quite the right way of going about it. I think the focus on buildings can distract from some of the bigger functional issues that we see in a lot of developments where there's very much a car focus, where there's not a very well or clearly thought out strategy for cycling or for pedestrians. And so, you know, concentrating on that built form and fabric, although it's very, very important, it shouldn't necessarily come at the expense of other elements of the development, I don't think.
And so it's picking up on that point, it's of the where people instantly jump to the additional cost of good design. But actually, what you're saying is that if much focus goes on the space in between the buildings, and that's factored in from the early stage, then actually it's cost neutral. It's just the focus embedded from day one.
Exactly, exactly.
And it's sort of picking up on that point is a question from Jerry Marshall. To achieve excellence in design and landscape within new developments, does the panel think that the highways authorities are likely to become more flexible, or does the way forward lie with more new streets not being offered for adoption? And Nick, I'll come to you because I know it's something that you've been grappling with recently. So what's your thoughts on that?
Putting it fairly bluntly, they won't have the money to deal with the quality of specification of materials that I think create good environments. And therefore, if you're quite happy with black tarmac, concrete curbs and black bay paths with very limited landscaping around it, then carry on. But in reality, I think if you want a quality of design, you're going to have to hold on to those areas and look after them and create a service charge on any development that goes into the long-term holding and trust. So I'm pretty clear. The local authority just won't have the wherewithal to actually be able to take that on board.
And actually, just factoring in that from day one, Nick ends up with a better design, less sort of road-hungry layouts, and sort of betterments in terms of the public realm and landscaping.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the other conundrum that the local authority have got is that they know that we're a car-dependent society at the moment. Yet we're all striving within designs to try and mitigate and reduce transport requirements, and their regulatory requirements in terms of what you do with roads don't really lend themselves to the solutions which we're looking at, which is to try and deliberately avoid cars being in the areas where which impacts one environment. So there are two sets of different conundrums about sustainability and long-term car use with highways that just can't be resolved at the moment, and we'll need some thought about them in the future.
Thanks, Nick. Mark, can I come back to you, because obviously one of the tenets sort of running through the white paper is the focus on increased community engagement, particularly in terms of coming up with the local design codes that's based on local vernacular. How do you think that we're really going to see that improved community engagement that actually sort of engages with a cross-section of society rather than certain parts, certain demographics who are more willing to engage at the present time?
I think time's moved on. COVID has moved the world on in terms of digital engagement. Totally. There's a number of platforms we're engaged with that because they're social media led, their LinkedIn campaigns, their Twitter campaigns to reach out, they very much hit 35 to 45 demographic. I think they'll be much more progressive in terms of their approach to architecture, which will be great. But the problem with the design code and freezing it is it stops innovation, doesn't it? All the things that architects and designers are good at, coming up with the solutions. Look at schemes being designed now to 5-10 years ago, Neil. They're utterly different. And my problem with anything frozen, it goes back to one of the earlier questions about bureaucracy. Let creativity have its reign. Don't tie people down to a point in time. We can all look at estates and say that was from 1988, that was from 1995. You know, let's not tie people down to the degree that the government seems to think it needs to do. There's other ways of doing this. And I think one of the questions we've got, Neil, is about the cost of design codes. They are hugely time consuming on multi-parcel sites where someone has to go first with their design codes. And I'm not a fan.
Danny, can I bring you in on this? Because obviously, as someone responsible and working probably with design codes day in, day out, obviously the government's seeking to assure the public that design codes will be there to police and monitor standards moving forwards. But can design codes be too prescriptive from your perspective and actually sort of hamper creative freedom?
Yeah, I think they can. You know, it depends at what point of the process the design code is being rolled out, and how I suppose that interacts with the development of a place that's a place in its own right as well. in terms of local and the local sort of component of it and how that works, I think Mike's quite right, where there's a bit of a fundamental conflict between potentially some of the people who've traditionally been involved in public consultation and those who were sort of looking to get involved by rolling out some of the digital consultation. I think that kind of discussion might change. But I mean, in terms of how that then potentially may impact on a design code for a given plot within a growth area, we all know that design codes can mean many things to many people, and they can be very, very loose, or they can be very, very prescriptive. And so coming to an understanding, and I think this is where I'll be eagerly awaiting what the National Model Design Code looks like, where we can agree a level of detail that is appropriate, I think is going to be a very, very key touch point as to whether or not these documents are quite flexible and are something that can be used to create something new and inspiring that is still accepted by the community, or whether they are just a more prescriptive document which then turns some of what we do into more of a box ticking exercise. So I think I'll eagerly await to see what the National Model Design Code suggests, because I think, you know, they can be at many levels of detail and mean very many different things to many different people.
Okay, thanks, Danny. Danny and Mike, bringing it to both of you, where do you think this leaves modular construction moving forward, which typically uses a lot of standardised plots and sort of repetition of plots on the site? Do you still see a place for modular moving forward to help sort of accelerating growth, or do you think it could be more of a challenge? Danny, I'll stay with you for now.
Yeah, I think it will have to be a very well written design code to make sure that it does leave room for modular construction. But I think that especially considering the some of the benefits of modular construction, it's something that needs to be very, very well considered. And I know Mike's got some experience on this, so I might hand over to him for a slightly more detailed feedback.
Well, let's go back to COVID. We spent most of the time inside the house in the last 6 months, haven't we? 5 months. What modular offers, and David's actually selling the product. What modular offers you is a huge amount of variety to lay out that house. So what you can do is order from the factory. It offers you a degree of flexibility that traditional build can't for the occupant and the house types that we have. And I see no diminution in design. Procter & Matthews are the architects on In-Home, which is the Northstowe scheme, and the quality of the architecture is exemplary, it's award-winning. So you can still detail them, you can still provide the external architecture, you can still, and the landscaping is key to all of that. But what modular does offer is this infinite variety of layouts within house types in terms of the prospective purchaser, and I think that's really exciting. I don't know, David.
I was going to say, bring David in here actually, just to give his thoughts in terms of the modular schemes that you're currently you've been involved with, how they've been received in the marketplace, and how do they give that wow factor that you were talking about?
We haven't honestly seen a great deal of it around here. Neil, I've been up to see the schemes with Urban Splash. We are involved on the Northstowe project with Urban Splash, and I must admit it's quite interesting walking around their factory, seeing these things being built. And some of the schemes they've got, sort of Manchester, Birmingham, are, you know, do look very good quality. You know, they're award winning. They look no different to any of the product down here. And to be honest, the Northstowe, they've got a variety of different designs as well. I don't think they're all factory produced, but there's a combination on there. So, and it's quite unique, as Mike said, choosing where, you know, what different layouts you have, whether it's a 2-bedroom, a 1-bedroom, or a 5-bedroom. So it's quite different. Be quite interesting to see how it is received in the marketplace compared to standard product, which it will be competing against out at Northstowe. But actually, I think it's really exciting. Certainly, there's no different from an elevational perspective, I see. But we are at the beginning of a journey, let's say, in Cambridge. So we'll ask me that question in 18 months' time, when hopefully I haven't got an awful lot of stock out there.
Hey, stay with you, David. Obviously, we've mentioned Accordia a couple of times, and there's other examples which are currently underway in Cambridge, which have got sort of a similar sort of high focus on design standards, which you could argue are driving a premium to other sites in the local area. How much of it do you truly think is down to the design at Accordia? Is that just one strand of many? And can you translate that Accordia into any other town across the region, or does Accordia just help by the fact it's a very good road in central Cambridge?
I think there's a lot for that. I don't think you can necessarily isolate and say it's all down to the design. I think the design itself was quite groundbreaking for the city when it first happened. You know, and bearing in mind that first project that was planned for there was not contemporary style. It was more of the Cambridge vernacular. And when you first saw it on plan, you thought, my goodness, we're stepping completely outside the box and beyond. I'm sure you could demonstrate it. I'm sure, you know, Oxford has its scheme similar. And I think, but I don't think it's just down to design, is my honest opinion. I think that's a big part of it. But I think, as I said, you know, earlier on, you know, you literally, that value add starts as soon as you step out of your car and turn the corner, you know, in the placemaking and the gateway, you know, the amenities, more so sustainability now. And I think, you know, and location, which I think is a big thing for Accordia. So without question, I think it's a combination of factors. But I think design is becoming more and more up that ladder, definitely.
Can I ask a question of that? Do you think it's been a blessing and a curse? Because it's kind of like every scheme that's flowed from the city. How much Accordia style stock have you sold in the last 12 years, David? This is the danger.
Far too many.
This is the danger of codes, isn't it?
You know, it seems to have set the benchmark, didn't it? And then all of a sudden, that's all we had. You know, we've now got certain of the fringe schemes that have got pitched roofs, and we're starting to creep back more into more traditional contemporary styles, if there is such a thing. But no, I think it's, you know, it's time to move on, let's say. But it certainly set the benchmark for the city, and then the Reba flag really has reinforced it. You know, and to be honest, there's probably been, no disrespect to architects out there's been probably more architects that have been down there than what there have been purchasers, you know, because of its design. But it was a difficult animal to sell, and that's what people forget. You know, to step on the inside of that, it didn't start to flow. You know, Countryside didn't finish that scheme, Reedham did. And did it make any money? Don't know. I'm told not, but certainly it's making money now for people that live there, because their values have gone up over 100%, 120%, I think Danny said it was. So incredible.
Danny, just going to you, and actually Jeff Yates had made a comment on the Accordia scheme that whilst it was lauded for its design quality, it potentially had some issues because of the sort of the segregation between sort of private and social residents. Is there a danger that actually there's too much focus just on the design of the houses again, and actually we need to be looking at design in sort of a much wider focus? I'm actually just looking back, there was a question that Emmanuel had submitted on one of the previous webinars saying, would you agree that green credentials is often considered secondary and perhaps will remain so for a while yet at the front end of a competitive land bidding process? And how do we design places to encourage physical activity and fight the obesity crisis? Do you see this as an opportunity to actually have far greater focus on community well-being as well as just physical house design, Danny?
Absolutely. I think it's very much about mixing your tenures and your types and making sure that the way that they're distributed within a development is very sensitive. I think it's been in the press for many years now, especially in London, around the poor doors that occur in some developments, and I think that is not conducive to creating a good community. We want to make sure that it's balanced and that it works well together, and that there is space for everybody within that community. And creating a strict sort of segregating line between the two doesn't necessarily achieve that, I don't think. But I think you're quite right to link that to some of those wellbeing and health and activity factors as well too, because that is something that can be provided as part of, as you say, good design, but it's something that isn't necessarily a financial barrier to entry. It's something that's open to all. It's something that can also knit a proposed development into its surrounding community with a greater degree of success, I think, than activation can, because it will become a bit more of a natural process. So making sure that we're considering sort of really good access routes, providing play on the way, making sure that there's spaces for all age groups and all income levels within some of those open spaces, I think is going to become more and more important as part of creating a true community, rather than just a development which is sort of isolated in both its style and character, but also in some of its social connections as well.
Okay, thanks, Danny. Mike, come to you to see in terms of what's embedded within the white paper. I think we've seen in sort of recent times a lot of the sort of the volume house builders retreating to sort of standardised products to try and assist with cost control and speed of delivery. Do you think that what's been set out and the proposal for a fast track for beauty will encourage them to look and focus more on good design if they think that they've got quid pro quo of getting quicker consents? Is that going to be enough to bring them back to the table to drive the quality agenda?
I think a lot of the house types are good. I think the nervousness for a number of the house builders will be this focus on local vernacular. And what will that mean? And I have very severe doubts that anything will be fast tracked, because the areas of subjectivity around what is good design, it goes back to my duck rabbit. It is such a complicated, complex subject. And at the end of the day, it's one of the areas where local authorities at the end of the process, the planning committee, can put their hand on the heart and say, I disagree with the advice I've got on design. It's subjective. I'm going to go in a different direction. So there's no guarantee in the planning process, because the courts remind us up until the very last minute that planning committee is not meant to have made a judgment. Nothing fetters their judgment until they enter that planning committee meeting room and make a decision. The whole system is based on this mad assumption that all this hard work, all this just is going to be synthesized through this planning committee and come out with the right product. My view is there needs to be a more fundamental review of the decision-making process before we get that fast track guaranteed.
Well, sort of leads nicely to a question that's coming from Jasmine Philpott, who said that one of the recurring issues in delivering beauty and good design was the power held by planning committees, despite their limited expertise, unrepresentative makeup and anti-development bias. Do you think there'll ever be a genuine overhaul whereby politically elected committees are abolished and replaced by a more accurate and fair decision-making process?
Many committee members are educated, and we are lucky in a number of authorities locally to have architects on planning committee. But the point is well made. The point that we've made in our radical regen is that the business voice is silent on a planning committee, and that there needs to be a better balance between the technical professional side and the elected process. But I see from the white paper there's no steps towards diminishing the power of the elected official in all of this process. We talk about the local plans and the 30 months, but and the ability to allocate growth, renewal and protected areas, but we're giving it to the same people who've been giving it to since 1974 to make the same decisions they've been making since 1974, and saying they're going to suddenly make different decisions. So I think that's the fundamental weak point in the system, is that there's too much tension, too much pressure when we get to the political decision-making process. And they're big, tough decisions, and they're going to be really important.
Before we actually get to that decision-making evening, what do you think that the government needs to do? What do you think local authorities need to do in terms of resource? We know the challenges a lot of local authorities are under. How do we get more people with the right skills and experience working for the councils to drive this forward?
Well, we had the same experience. I was a chief plan officer in the early 2000s, and we had something called Planning Delivery Grant. And I worked in an authority that was the fifth highest performing authority in the country at the time. And we got substantial awards. It wasn't ring-fenced. So it wasn't ring-fenced to the planning teams. So the income that's coming into local authorities wasn't ring-fenced. If there is money that's being put forward through the process in the next few years, which it sounds like it is, which is really encouraging, it needs to be ring-fenced for the improvements of those services.
Brilliant. I'm just going to bring Giles Dobson just into the discussion. Giles, obviously, sort of the publication of the white paper, the increased focus on design. This harks back to the very first webinar that we had 8 weeks ago now. I presume that you're sort of a positive supporter in terms of the intent that's set out, and think that sort of many of your landowner clients will equally be sort of supportive of the intent set out in it.
Absolutely, Neil. And as you'd imagine, it's something we've been discussing lots with the landowners over the last week or two. And pretty much every single one of them is going back to this and saying, but we were saying this earlier, we were saying this already. This is something we really want to bring into our developments. I had a conversation with colleagues and clients this morning, and they were saying, but no, we want to do this. This is something we actively want to promote. So, Neil, I completely agree. I think it's just exactly what they were looking for.
Okay. Mike, coming back to you, you made the comment about the potentially the white paper is not ambitious enough. What other suggestions would you have? Where next would you go? How would you push the boundaries?
Well, the resourcing is starting to pop out, but I think for me, the decision-making processes within planning need to be reviewed, fundamentally reviewed. You look at the way the Corporation of London works with aldermen, and you look at, and politicians are a key part of democracy. We can't have a democracy without politicians. Business is a huge part of local economies and the local social environment. Business needs a bigger voice in the planning process, and we need more professional advice. We're talking about codifying, we're talking about streamlining. To do that, then we need straightforward political advice, non-political advice, impartial advice involved in the decision-making process at the end. That to me is fundamental, and that's 32 years of experience, 16 years in local government, looking how it operated, 16 years on this side, seeing that operates. That we need to fundamentally alter the decision-making process to really make a difference to all of these things. So if we've got 2 architects on a planning committee, it's gone through 2 design review panels, and the design is acknowledged as good up until that point, their voice will be heard at that planning committee meeting.
So, Mike, is that you suggesting, Mike, that the decision makers at planning committee cannot be an elected member?
Because I think that's just not plausible in a democracy. There has to be that fallback position, that there is a number of elected members on that planning committee. That I think that's right and proper, but not to the degree that we have now, where it's exclusively elected members. And they are impartial, they're trained and everything like that, but it is a crazy political process. It's not meant to be. They're meant to wear a completely different hat when they sit in the planning committee. That's not ward related, it's not politically party related, but the decision-making process is tough. It's under a lot of pressure, it's unpopular, it's influential. So I think we need to de-stress it, depoliticize it, and see if there's a way of bringing more people into that process and streamline it, make it more technocratic.
Thanks. Conscious that we're pretty much up against it on time, but I just want to come to all of you, just in terms of your thoughts on what's been set out in the white paper, and whether we're heading in the right direction on design. So there's been some mixed reaction and mixed commentaries in terms of the paper to date. Concerns that actually it leaves the doors open for developers to reduce quality. Mike, starting with you, what's your thoughts? Is it a sort of step in the right direction? Something that you're supportive of?
I applaud it, but I'm struggling to see the tools that we have in the NPPF at the moment that say it's fundamental success. I struggle to see why it's a radical change at the moment. I don't see a radical change in that second pillar at the moment. I don't see it as a radical change. Resourcing local authorities would be a very positive change. And if that happens, and that alone happens, that will be positive.
Danny, positive step in the right direction?
Yeah, I think, as Mike says, the resource would always be welcomed. I think using the National Design Guide as a tool to maybe raise the standard nationally in terms of the quality of design in areas where it doesn't necessarily pay off at the moment is to be welcomed, and that would very much come down to the quality of the local design code as to whether or not that is successful or not. Other than that, I feel a bit conflicted, to be honest.
Thanks, Danny. David, what's your thoughts? Good or bad?
Well, if I'm honest, Neil, I haven't digested the white paper fully because I'm not a planner, but from a design perspective, I'm all for pushing the boundaries on design, but I probably caveat that in the, not forgetting the practicalities of living. which is where we probably struggle sometimes. So the value adding good design is definitely there. But absolutely, yeah.
Thanks. Nick, what's your thoughts?
I worry that the principles will actually slow down development because they'll generate something that's not affordable in areas where land values are and sales values aren't as high. So I think the deliverability of government requirement for accommodation in the future could actually be hampered by this as a solution. I welcome the desire to try and accelerate the planning process. I think we all get utterly infuriated by the time it takes us to get a consent. Will it be right? I think the politicians are on a hiding to nothing, whichever way you look at it. So and let's give it a try and then see where we go from there. It can only be amended later on if we need to.
And last but by no means least, Giles, renewed focus, continued focus on design and quality.
I think great, yeah, largely supportive. I do go, I think I echo Mike's comment. I just wonder whether this could end up as saying a damp squib is probably a little bit too strong, but is it far enough? Will it actually change anything? Will it actually make anything different? And certainly in terms of the strategic changes, is it a double-edged sword? We've all known what Mr. Sunak's done with his very, very, very open and honest tax rebates for businesses and so on. That can only come with tax changes in the future. I worry from a landowner perspective that what has been put forward in this paper is going to be a real double-edged sword and will be accompanied by some very severe tax disadvantages for landowners.
Okay. Thank you very much, Giles. We're out of time. I'd just like to say thanks very much to everyone who's contributed this afternoon. Mike, Danny, David, Nick and Giles, thanks so much for being able to join us. Thank you to everyone who's joined this afternoon and across the series of 4 webinars. We've really enjoyed doing them. It's been really useful sort of debate and being able to engage with all of you. I hope you found it useful. If anyone's got any further questions or you want to pick up any of the points that we've discussed over the series, then please get in touch with any one of us. We'll be pleased to chat through. And with that, I'll leave you to it and enjoy the rest of your days. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Neil.
Thank you.